Sometime last year, I created a video called Why I'm Ditching Ubuntu in Favour of Linux Mint. That video has now become the most popular video on my channel with a total view count of 153,700 views. It's 37 minutes long of me doing nothing other than rambling about why I'm shifting operating systems. And today I'm going to talk about some of the comments left on that video as well as what's happened since then. But to think that that video of me rambling for about 3/4 of an hour would ever reach that many views has bamboozled me quite a lot. But, you know, life never fails to amaze us all. So, some of the comments. Well, a lot of people were wondering why it took me 37 minutes to effectively discuss why I'm moving from one operating system to another when I could have discussed it in about 3 minutes. Well, basically, it's because I was making that video for 500 subscribers, not the 5,000 subscribers I have today. And I knew those 500 subscribers a lot better. We were a lot more... well, first of all, the channel was a lot more unpolished, and I knew that the people watching the video would be more interested in a long-form video talking about something which is quite a dry subject to talk about. And I believe it got posted somewhere, maybe on Reddit or some forum or whatever, and it just kind of spiraled out of control from there. It also taught me a lot about how videos tend to accumulate their views as well. The video itself never reached many views until a couple of months after it had been uploaded, and then it suddenly started reaching thousands upon thousands of views. It seemed to snowball from then, and it's still getting views and comments today. So when people ask me why did it take me 37 minutes to get to the point, well, I didn't know 150,000 people were going to be watching it. So if I knew it was going to be that big a success, I probably would have put a bit more polish onto it. Okay, so another question is, one of the reasons or one of the differences that people mostly bring up when it comes to comparing Ubuntu and Linux Mint are the differences is the desktop environment that is used. The primary desktop environments for Linux Mint are Mate, or Mate as it's supposedly pronounced, and Cinnamon. Two layouts which are very similar to Windows 7, I guess, is what you compare it to. Mate doesn't look like Windows 7 out of the box, but Linux Mint have changed the layout so that it does look so that it's more accommodating to Windows converts. And Ubuntu's primary user interface is Unity, quite possibly the most controversial user interface known to man, really. I really do not like Unity. I've tried it time and time again. I've tried it for extended periods of time, and there are a number of reasons why I don't like using it. Part of it is that it doesn't feel responsive. Another part is that it, as far as I'm concerned, when you start putting taskbars on the side of screens, you start infringing on screen real estate that you can't really afford to lose. Because obviously we have left to right, or English, which is my primary language, moves from left to right. It makes sense to me to have left to right to keep that as free as possible. And then when you're sort of encroaching on desktop space using taskbars, the top and the bottom are the ones where you can most afford to lose space. Even, that's one of the reasons why we shifted to a 16:9 standard screen aspect ratio, is because wider screens are just a better use of the space. So, some people might feel that as a result of that extra width, we can afford to put some taskbars there, but not for me. Joshua Chow, who's someone who I do work on a collab channel with, actually outlined it very well, why he actually prefers. He uses Windows 7, I think, if I remember correctly, and he puts the taskbar, he actually adjusts it so that it is on the left-hand side, because he uses a laptop, and it's a lot easier to swipe left to get to your taskbar on a laptop than it is to swipe up or down. And I think that if you're using a tracker pad on a laptop, I think that might be a significantly more it makes a lot more sense. So anyway, in regards to the user interface, we can't deny that distributions are built around their desktop environment to one degree or another. That's why you have various different distributions. Even within the Ubuntu family, you have Ubuntu, which has, of course, Unity. You have Xubuntu, which has the XFCE. You have Kubuntu, which uses KDE. You have like Lubuntu, which uses LXDE. Then you have Ubuntu Mate and Ubuntu GNOME, which obviously use their respective desktop environments. So there is a reason why why a number of people feel that having a separate desktop environment warrants its own distribution. Now, if I was the person making the deciding say, I would put those options in an installer rather than have completely separate distributions, just to make it a little bit easier, so that you can have one website rather than having 5 or 6. But that being said, though, to me it does make sense to have a distribution built around the desktop environment. Let's say, for example, that I was using Ubuntu and then suddenly wanted to use a KDE desktop. Rather than using Kubuntu, the KDE variant, I just installed the KDE desktop environment. I would have KDE and the apps and all the environmental stuff that comes along with it on top of all the Unity stuff. It would make the size of my distribution significantly larger than it needed to be. It would mean that I would effectively have 2 of every kind of program, a KDE version and an Ubuntu version. So there would be a lot of bloat. And then if your follow-up question is, well, why don't you remove Unity? Well, in my experience, and as is a general recommendation among distributions, is that you shouldn't really start removing programs that come with a distribution, because it can affect stability. And I find that out myself as well. So yes, just from that standpoint alone, it does make sense to choose your distribution to some degree based on your user, the desktop environment. That being said, some desktop environments can sit on top of other distributions easier than others. LXDE is a prime example. You can put LXDE on top of Ubuntu or on top of a Linux Mint with very little repercussions, because LXDE is just such a lightweight desktop environment, or as I believe it's moving to, LXQT. Now, I would put LXQT, or I'd certainly be more inclined to put LXQT on top of a distribution that comes with KDE, and I'd put LXDE on top of a distribution that would run a GTK toolset. But that being said, with those things aside, the lighter the desktop environment, the more portable it is, I guess might be the term you'd use. But I wouldn't put something like KDE on top of a distribution that comes with GNOME. That, to me, would just cause far too much bloat, far too much use. It's not even necessarily a disk space issue. My disk space can withstand numerous installations of operating systems, as you guys know from my distribution demonstrations. But I think a part of it is feeling you're just wasting disk space, and a lot of it is that your menus just then become cluttered up with applications that you don't need. And I prefer to have applications that are owned. I prefer to install applications that I'm going to use and to it's clutter. It's clutter, basically, and it's not nice for a user space, particularly towards not just for users like myself, but also for newcomers. And I think with newcomers as well, you would very much expect them to use the default desktop environment. So I'd certainly forgive any distribution that wanted to appeal to a mass market for using a very simplified version of a user interface like what Mint have done. They've made Mate look like Windows 7 quite a lot. They haven't overdone it, but they've certainly given it. They've put things in the place where Windows 7 users are likely to look. So there's a lot more to it than just, why don't you just install another desktop environment? Well, because of bloat, because I don't want to have 2 of every applications stuffing up my menus and all that kind of stuff. And I like to keep my system as lean as possible. That being said, though, that's to me inconsequential, especially now that Ubuntu Mate is coming out. You have, I can choose desktop environments across the board. I could use Ubuntu GNOME and then put Cinnamon on top of that, which would probably sit quite nicely. So it's certainly not about a UI. It's certainly not a question of user interface. There is another difference between Linux Mint and Ubuntu, which is certainly more prevalent now than it used to be, and that's that Linux Mint base their distribution on Ubuntu long-term support releases as standard, but they have 6-month upgrades but still based on the long-term support release of Ubuntu that it's based on. I like this. It means it's stable, but it means that a lot of applications are also updated to their latest version. It's also worth bearing in mind that you're not necessarily stuck with out-of-date or sort of software that isn't updated very often as a result of using a distribution that's only updated every 2 years, because you can install, of course, PPAs and separate repositories that upgrade software as new versions become available. And in fact, that's almost essential if you want to run a full-featured Linux operating system. You're going to have to at some point install software that isn't in the repositories, or as I'm sure we're going to end up referring to it, the App Store. And certainly the Ubuntu repositories are looking more and more like an app store by the day. But by and large, I don't necessarily have a problem with that. Canonical's got to fund itself somehow, and I think that as long as it pays as long as it's true to open source values, then I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I know there's a lot of debate to be had around whether or not Canonical and Ubuntu stay true to their open source values. Feel free to have it down in the description below, but it's a complicated one. In regards to philosophy as well, so sort of moving on from that nice little segue, I prefer the philosophy of Linux Mint to the philosophy of Ubuntu. The philosophy of Ubuntu is a very corporate one. I don't necessarily have a problem with that being the case. Canonical has done a lot for Linux. It's done a lot for GNU Linux in terms of the GNU user space as well. But that being said, and certainly in terms of promoting it more than anything else. But that being said, it still does have a corporate mantra, whereas Linux Mint is very much a community-orientated one. Linux Mint is funded through advertisements on its website as well as donations, whereas I guess Ubuntu is to a degree, but it's also funded from making money through its app store / repositories as well, and it uses it sells licenses and as well to for redistribution and stuff like that, which is one of the reasons why SteamOS decided to base its OS on Debian and not Ubuntu, was because they'd rather just develop the differences between Debian and Ubuntu and then not have to pay Canonical the license fees, which it's a savvy business move. Can't deny for that. Also, Debian gives them a lot more freedom than Ubuntu will as well. But that aside, Linux Mint listens to its community a lot more than Canonical. Canonical will listen to its marketing department and its in its analytics, whereas and it will also, Ubuntu will want you to use its operating system a certain way, hence why it's put in that Amazon commission search. So whenever there's a lot of controversy about the Amazon search feature in Ubuntu effectively being, many people have labeled it spyware. And whereas that's not a million miles from the truth, especially considering that it's not as well publicized in maybe the installer as it should be, Canonical does get a small amount of money every time that you do use that Amazon search. So it's a way of funding itself. And to be honest, if it was more open about it, I would be more inclined to participate in that as well. Or whether or not it was optional and you selected that option at the install level. Again, then I'd be more inclined to participate in it, but because they've almost tried to slip it in under the radar, that's something that I would steer away from. I'm not outraged or angry about it. It's just something that, well, I have an option not to engage, so I'm not going to. And Linux Mint wouldn't do that kind of thing. In fact, well, actually, tell a lie. They kind of do. There are certain search engines that do commission Linux Mint to use them, so Linux Mint does get some funding every time you use certain browsers, but those browsers at the same time respect your privacy. I think DuckDuckGo could be one of them, but don't quote me on that one. But it still allows Linux Mint to generate some kind of revenue without actually having to sacrifice any of its community values. And community values is why I do like Linux Mint. It does listen to the community, it asks the community questions, it engages with the community, and many of the alternative versions are directly from the community as well, the XFCE and the KDE versions, I think. So the idea that it's just a UI thing is why I switched from Ubuntu to Mint is a complete fallacy. It's mostly around a philosophy and community values ideals as well. I also like the idea that, well, if Ubuntu disappeared off the face of the earth tomorrow, Linux Mint, of course, would still remain because they do have a Debian edition. What I would like to see Linux Mint perhaps try and do is to base a distribution on Debian stable. That being said, though, one of the big benefits of Linux Mint being based on Ubuntu is that it's compatible with Ubuntu software. And when you see very exciting new pieces of software like Open Broadcast software being brought out for Linux, which is recording and screen cap software that we have not seen that level, that professional grade multimedia software on Linux ever. This is breaking new ground, and to have to go through a whole lot of trial and errors and tweaking and whatever, try and get it working on a non-Ubuntu operating system is likely to be very frustrating. So the fact that it has Linux Mint compatibility is something that I'm quite grateful for, if I'm honest. Then again, there's no reason why they couldn't tweak it and turn Debian to become more like that. And I'm sure they've given it some thought. But yeah, it is a community value. So that's why I by and large am still on Linux Mint. I'm running Linux Mint 17.1, the KDE edition. I think maybe next time I either upgrade or decide to change desktop environments, I might not necessarily stick with the KDE version, but I'm certainly going to stick with Linux Mint. It's unlikely that I'll go back to Ubuntu. And also, again, another reason in terms of values as to why I did switch from Ubuntu to Mint, and why I'm happy I made that switch, is because Mint does put a higher value on system stability, whereas Ubuntu often will edge towards the bleeding edge side of things. I respect people that like to live on the bleeding edge. It's one of the reasons why I have so much respect for Arch users, because they do live on the bleeding edge. They are not afraid to try out the newest versions of software and to fix the problems that might arise. And I think that the wider Linux and wider GNU Linux community do owe them a lot in that regards. So I think that's about it from me today. I obviously wanted to keep this video to a degree shorter than the 37-minute long one, but I'm going to, of course, annotate the original to allow people to watch this as either a shorter version or as a way of answering some of the questions in the comment section below. But that's about it for me today. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to leave your comments down in the comments section below. And until next time, I've been Chris Ware, and you've been awesome. Take care now.